Welcome to Subject to Talent, brought to you by Allegiance Global Solutions. Similar to you, we're always trying to learn more. On this podcast, we speak to workforce and talent experts from around the world, covering market trends, technology, and our ever-evolving dynamic industry. Hi, I'm Bruce Morton, the new host of Allegiance Global Solutions Subject to Talent podcast. And while I'm new to this hosting gig, I'm definitely not new to the talent industry, having been in the game for over 40 years. I'm excited to be here today with our guest, Shon Burton. Shon is the founder of HiringSolved, a leading talent intelligence platform. And we're going to be discussing how companies are and should be using artificial intelligence to help them find and retain the very best talent. Welcome, Shon, and thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Hey, Bruce. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So as our regular listeners will know, we like to start off all of our podcasts hearing how our guests got to where they are today. So, Shon, can you tell us how you came to be in the workforce solutions industry and the backstory on founding HiringSolved?
Sure. Yeah, it's exciting. I was an engineer and didn't like recruiters very much. And then finally went through a cycle where I did like them because I realized they could negotiate for me, which was great. And then I got talked into 10 years later or so, I got talked into starting a recruiting firm by a great recruiter. And this was in San Francisco in the tech industry there. So we started recruiting for hard to find tech, particularly for customers like Google, Apple, some of the big tech companies and some of the early stage startups that became huge, like Dropbox and others. So, Twitter when they were 6 people. So we were doing that. And I was just shocked. As an engineer, I was shocked at how hard that was, like at how hard we had to work to place people. And immediately started thinking about, after about a year of beating my head against the wall, started thinking about how can we automate some of this stuff? How can we make some of this process a little bit easier? Because the amount of hours it would take us to place, an engineer at Google was just ridiculous, So that's where the idea for HiringSolved came from.
And what year was that, without aging you?
Yeah, that was 2011. So I'd been doing recruiting for about 2 years.
Okay.
By that time, where I sort of was like, wait a second, there's got to be a different way to do this.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll dive back into HiringSolved a bit later on in the conversation, but the topic today is around the hype around artificial intelligence. Every day you see something online about AI or ML, and there's a lot of hype around that, but not many people, I think, really have a deep understanding of what artificial intelligence actually is. So let me ask you a simple question to ask, but I don't know how easy it is to answer, but simple for me to ask is, what can AI do and what can't it do?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. So what we have today in the sort of state of the art of AI, it can do some things that humans can do, for example, image recognition or finding patterns in video, audio, documents, things like that. That previously only humans could really do. So examples of that are, look at a resume. Let's say we got a stack of 1,000 black and white resumes, and I give them to a human and say, tell me which ones are male and which ones are female, right? No pictures, just black and white resumes printed out. So previously, if we go back maybe 20 years, that was pretty hard for a computer to do, and it wouldn't be very good at it. The best, humans they're great at pattern matching. They're great at looking at that snapshot and very quickly figuring out, based on essentially a pattern, whether that's male or female, and they'll put that in the pile. Where we are today is that artificial intelligence lets us do a bunch of stuff like that. Because we've been able to train it on lots of samples and there's lots of different techniques. But so we think about, only give me the pictures of dogs, and I'm going to give you 1 million pictures, or only show me the YouTube videos that show cats, or show me which emails are spam, or the diversity sort of resume idea that I just talked about. Machines are actually quite good at doing this. What they can't do is what we call generalized artificial intelligence. So that's sort of your C3PO, where it can just do anything. It could tie a shoe. It could play a game of chess. The same system could tell jokes, could, fix a broken dishwasher. We don't have that. And just to be clear, nobody in the world has that. This is an unsolved problem, as they say in AI, so which is this general intelligence.
So is the word artificial even the right word for it? I mean, it's in the lexicon now, but is it truly artificial?
Well, it's really interesting that's a great, interesting question too, because I think what AI is showing us, and particularly when we think about neural networks, what they're showing us is that maybe what this looks like is this is an underlying organizational principle of the universe. Like literally, it doesn't matter that the techniques that we're using in the neural networks that we're using, those structures happen to be based in software, but they're the melon on top of my head does a lot of the same stuff. So there's this idea, for example, of reinforcement learning. A depressed human brain has certain chemical changes that make it less good at reinforcement learning. It's less good at perceiving the pleasure that comes with doing the thing right. And so it's literally less good in a depressed human brain at that type of learning. We have reinforcement learning in artificial neural networks that work the same way, but they tend not to get depressed because we can control that, right? But yeah, it is a good word for it. And there's a whole other debate of whether this or that thing is AI or not. But when we think of artificial neural networks, they are absolutely they earn that moniker because they really are a structure that is very similar to what's going on in what we think is going on in the human brain and animal brains.
Right. And obviously this has been around for a long time. I know it's always been called AI or not, but I'm thinking back, when Watson was playing chess and beating the world masters, that is the artificial intelligence. I'm sure the machine is understanding if this, joining the dots of 30 moves ahead the same way as a brain would, that's been trained that way. So it's been around for so long, but why is it AI so hard in the world of human resources? If it is, do you feel that human resources are behind other industries?
Yes, it's crushingly hard in human resources. Yes. If I had only known that, Bruce, before I went in. So human resources, what it is neural networks are not good at explaining why they know something. So still today, if you look at the science around how someone actually catches a baseball, there's a lot of complexity going there, and there's not a great description of how that really works at a really granular level. The problem, and computer neural networks are the same. There's kind of a saying in the industry that goes, the better the thing works, the less we understand why it works. So a lot of these artificial neural networks are very much black box things in the sense that we generally understand the structure, but we unlike a sort of traditional software, deterministic software, it's very hard for us to trace through step by step and understand why the AI arrived at a decision. And that turns out, because HR is this heavily regulated industry, as is something like medicine, where there are lawsuits and stuff for doing it wrong. It turns out that that's crushingly hard. I think aside from that, when we use our example of resumes. So today, for example, HiringSolved, this is something we've been working on since probably 2014. And it's just, get a system that can reliably tell us, based on no other information than sort of a black and white resume, paper, idea of a resume, whether a candidate or an applicant is male or female. We now have systems that do this better than humans. So, of course, the machine can do that in less than 1 second. Human would take quite a bit longer to do 1,000 resumes. The machine's going to be more accurate over, any decent sample size than the human. Problem is, that's not good enough in HR tech. So in other industries, like, for example, financial trading, we have AI-based decision systems that are making trades and doing all this crazy stuff at light speed. But we don't expect them all. The only thing we expect in finance is that they perform well. So at the end of the day, we don't care why they thought what they thought, why they just dumped Bitcoin today and it went down 30 or 40%. We don't care what the answer is as long as they're performing well over a reasonable amount of time. Yeah, in HR tech, that's very much not the case. because of the compliance in the industry, it isn't good enough just to perform well. You have to perform well in a compliant way, which turns out to be really, really difficult.
Yeah, well, you made your bed and you got to line it, I guess. You got into the industry.
Yes, yeah. It's full of spikes and glass, but yes.
Yeah. So that's a nice segue into my next question in terms of defining terms. And you're a leading organization in talent intelligence. So how do you define or describe what talent intelligence is?
Well, I look at it as the analog to business intelligence. So, I look at it as in the 80s and 90s, we had built these database systems that contained all this data. We had accounting and, supply systems, supply chain, ERP, all this different stuff. But we didn't have much intelligence. We had systems that could tell us what the price of something was, but we didn't have systems that told us large scale trends and could give us predictions based on those trends. Business intelligence in the IT world changed all that by networking all those systems together and pulling all that data together to bring a layer of intelligence above all that the business could look at and realize, gosh, we use this one part in 50 different planes. If we could save 10 cents on that part, it would really create a lot of savings, for example. So talent intelligence, I think of as the same thing. It's really, there's a tremendous treasure trove of data in all these companies. It's the HRIS system that's telling us, what type of people have been successful at the company, what does longevity look like at the company, how does that break down geographically, and by department, by hiring manager, all these different trends that are historical. And then we've got the sort of ATS and apply side and who's applying and who's being accepted and how are they processing through interviews and things like that. And then we've got things like performance management systems and CRM systems to figure out all this other data. So talent intelligence is really sitting on top of all that, just in the same way as business intelligence was, and it's producing intelligence. Literally, it's distilling intelligence from all that information and lets us make recommendations and show patterns that we just didn't know were there.
That's exciting. And as you're saying all that, I can imagine some of our listeners thinking, okay, that sounds like a lot of integrations for a lot of different systems. Is this one of those? There's the danger of the CIO putting it in the too hard bucket when you get into those types of conversations. The size of the prize sounds amazing, but how do you get across some of those challenges of having to plug in those different data sources?
I mean, it is a huge challenge. It is a huge part of the challenge, just as it was with business intelligence.
Yeah.
Back in the 80s, 90s. Yeah, it's brutal. Actually, we know, we've seen a couple startups pretty well funded, 10, 20 million in funding, just pack up and go home, largely because of the integration or compliance challenges. So it is challenging, Bruce, but I always have said we are probably one of the world's foremost experts at getting data out of systems. We're pretty good at it. So that's one of the things that we focus a lot on is, and we actually find that's the very beginning stage of that intelligence. What we're seeing right now is that as soon as we get access to the first data set, we're able to generate a data quality report, give it back to the customer. And before we've even done anything, they're not even in the HiringSolved system. What it does for them is it shows them how ready they are for automation. And we have these amazing findings like, well, some company has 5 million records and they think, gosh, this is really valuable data. Once we analyze that data, we give them this report and we realize, hey, 27% of those are missing emails. 35% of those records, those millions of records, are missing resumes. There's no attachment to them. So, and then as we step through this data and show them, that's super valuable because they're still collecting all this data every day, in some cases in a really poor quality way that doesn't, that's the other interesting thing about AI is it runs on data. It doesn't really work well in the absence of data. So if you've got millions of people applying, but you're not collecting a resume for them, there's going to be some real limits to the type of automation you can do, for example.
Right. That's a great point. And I love that line I've heard you use in the past saying, what does your data know that you don't? I think that's such a provocative and a great question because it's, yeah. And it's something, the data is there, as you say, it's just getting access to it and making sense of it. I remember some years ago, an IT software client of ours, we we just did some manual tracking of who their superstars were in their sales team and who were the ones that, they're wanting to get rid of after a year or were leaving. And amongst all the data we were collecting, there was this one organization, one of their competitors. If they hired people from that competitor that had less than 2 years of experience, they were a superstar. If they hired people from the same organization that had been with that competitor more than 7 years, they bombed and they left within a year. And when I presented that to the global head of sales, it's like, wow, why is that? Like, do you care? He said, no, I don't. I said, exactly. Right. Just stop doing that and do more of that. Right. And it is, and that's just one little nugget of that, you can, if you spend the time to do that, the answers are there, right? The answers are within. It's just, how do you get to that and what do you do with it?
100%.
So talking of which, could you, just for our listeners to bring this to life a bit, just share some examples of how some of your clients, the converted, the ones that have seen the light, how they're using talent intelligence to their advantage?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll give a couple anecdotes. I mean, that are real world. One customer, a very large staffing firm, was being, had a diversity initiative and was working for a large multinational company doing a ton of hiring. And the diversity initiative essentially said hire, we need to be hiring more women, and we need to see that those percentages increase across the pipeline. So we want to see more women in interviews. We want to see more women in the pre-interview pipeline, all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, what we really want to measure is a large gain in women hires across the board. They didn't have the intelligence available to kind of parse back to the customer and say, here's where this is realistic and not. And one of the major requirements, because this customer had, I won't say any of these names, but they had let's just say a major company, two major companies that do a lot of warehousing. So one of the major hot recs was forklift operators, and they were beating their heads against the wall because they just couldn't achieve this required diversity mix, and particularly around female forklift operators. So, one of the things our system does is it can provide, you can run a search, and you can actually, in our system, you can actually talk to it like a Siri. So you can say, find me forklift operators in Wichita, Kansas with 5 years experience or something. And it comes back and you can say how many are female, and it'll give you the percentage. And then you can say, how does this compare with the workforce? And from there, it will go out and do a web search and try and figure out how your data, how your apply data or your database numbers compared to the general workforce that we see out there on the web. What the system came back with, and I did this live with them, what the system comes back with is, about 4% of all forklift operators are female. Across the entire United States, there's about 4% they're female. It's probably intuitive to us, but that was just a landmark moment to watch that team see that data presented, and it highlights a type of capability. This is where I think artificial intelligence is really interesting, because manually you couldn't do this computation. It would be grossly manpower, excessive to sit there and try and analyze the web, right? But we can do that in seconds, and they can go back to their hiring manager and say, hey, here are these 5 positions. One of them is forklift operator. The other one, there's 4 more of them that we don't think we can hit the diversity on, just because you're going to have to give us way more resources because, we're fighting against the current here. So that's one example. Other examples are even simpler than that. We, helped Lowe's hire 70,000 people in 90 days.
Wow.
And
70,000 in 90 days.
70,000 in 90 days were, it's in the news article. This is pre-pandemic, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I think 2019. And one of the things that they have very good data. Lowe's has amazing data, and they're very artful in the way that they think about it. But one of the things our system was able to do was find and boost the relevance of anyone that had ever worked at other similar stores, and get those people to the top of the list because they had similar experience. And, that seems really simple and silly, but again, sometimes artificial intelligence isn't really the sexy, cool stuff that's talking to you and making graphs. Sometimes it's something as simple as parsing through a bunch of, again, or black and white resumes and figuring out correctly, just parsing the data, figuring out correctly who worked at, some other hardware store that might be more relevant that we should bring to the top.
This got me thinking, do you think this is is it filling a gap that potentially should have been in the ATSs from the get-go, or I guess, when that intelligence is there, it seems as if you're adding value and getting more value out of an ATS system. Would that be correct?
Yes, you're definitely adding value to the ATS. And I kind of look at it as going back to that business intelligence versus talent intelligence. There are some real technical reasons why the ATS isn't the tool to do this with. And it's similar to the business intelligence stuff. In business intelligence, we have the data warehouse, right? And really what that was a different technology that was much better at crunching data in a non-relational way. So the ATS is there. And the way I look at the ATS is, ATS is a gold mine, but the gold mine never said it was easy to get the gold out of. That's not the gold mine's job, right? The gold mine's job is just to hold the gold and keep it safe. And it does a great job at that. So the ATS, that's the other interesting thing is that the ATS does a lot of stuff. It's the reason we've never become an ATS. These days it does a lot of stuff related to compliance, and making sure that data stays whole and we can track it and all that sort of stuff. But we have the flexibility as a not a system of record. I think you want to keep those things separate. I think you want to have the flexibility to go in and say we're going to access data across a bunch of containers, and we're going to bring them together in a new way with the new type of technology. And I think that becomes sticky for the ATS because of what it is.
Yeah, and that's a great analogy, that gold mine. And you're right, it's there to protect it in a way and hide it.
Yeah.
That's why ATS were designed for compliance and everything else. And then we complain that they don't do the cool stuff that you can do.
Yeah.
They were never built to do that. That's a great point. And my understanding is you are not unique, but slightly unusual for a software company, that you serve both the staffing industry and organizations' TA functions as well. Is it the same product, same conversations you have both sides of that fence, or are they coming at it from different angles?
Absolutely the same product on both sides. They do come at it from completely different angles. I'll be honest and say we've really pivoted more. We were always into big corporations because we tend to solve problems. It's easier to see the benefit of our solutions if you're having a lot of scale, like the Lowe's example. Right. But post-pandemic, we're really focused on staffing firms from a sales perspective. We find that they move very, very fast. We find that they're very, very busy because of the shortage of talent that's out there. And at the end of the day, we just make their bottom line fatter quicker, right? So, Whereas
they get paid for finding the needle in the haystack.
Yeah, exactly. They get paid for doing that. And corporate, although it's exactly the same product. Corporate uses actually completely different features. Staffing doesn't really get applies. Staffing goes out and hunts. They're the hunters. So they don't get people just applying. So there's literally feature sets, even though they run the same software. Staffing doesn't so much use some of our apply scoring stuff. They just don't use it because they don't get applies. Whereas corporate, in a lot of the big corporates, they're just drowning in apply, especially when things go crazy with the pandemic and stuff like that. I remember, when I was out of a job in the tech bust of, the 2002 or whatever, I was sitting there without a job. Yeah, I would apply to anything. I'm like, I can cut wood. I can, I'm a security engineer, but I could do a little cooking or whatever you need. Why not apply, right?
Yeah.
What the heck? Yeah. What's the cost to me to apply to all these different jobs, right? So yeah, we do see a lot of differences. We love the staffing companies, right, in the last year because they're moving very fast and they immediately see that increased bottom line with our software.
Yeah, well, that's great. It's great you've been able to pivot in a way to that market. Awesome. Well, Shon, we're coming up to time here, so obviously I want to thank you for joining us today. And making sense of what is sometimes a bit of a black hole or these phrases people throw around. So I think our audience are far more educated than they were 30 minutes ago, hopefully, in terms of the ins and outs of AI. But so those folks that want to learn more about talent intelligence and in particular HiringSolved, how do we find you?
Just go to HiringSolved.com and check us out.
Great. Thanks, Shon, and really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much, Bruce.
To learn more about AGS, please check us out at allegis-global-solutions.com. You can also send questions for me or our guests. Just tweet us here at Allegis Global with the hashtag #SubjectToTalent, or email us at subjecttotalent@allegis-global-solutions.com. And if you enjoyed our podcast today, please subscribe, rate us, and leave a review. Until next time, cheers.